I was surprised that people gesture at vastly different rates too. In one small study, some people gestured 10 times more than the other people. Is there anything known about, do people who gesture more, are they more fluent? Do they talk faster or something like that? Or is it kinda all over the place?
I think one of the really fascinating things about studying gesture is that gesture is obligatory in some ways, in that we don't yet know of a culture where nobody gestures. But within that very broad generalization that gesture is everywhere, it's not obligatory in terms of making a sentence grammatical. There are some sentences where, if I say, look at that over there, a pointing gesture is obviously going to be what helps resolve what over there is. But a lot of the time, whether or not I use a gesture and the exact type of gesture that I use is not making a sentence more or less grammatical. And so that creates that variation where, as you say, you can have a half a dozen people prompted to tell the same story using the same experimental methods, and you might get some people that have 6 or 8 gestures and some people that are using 40 gestures in the same narrative span. And sometimes these results about variation in gesture are not what we might think they are or expect them to be. So one of my favorites is that when we look at the difference between, say, Italian and Spanish, and then French and German on the other hand, there is a stereotype or an expectation that Italians and Spaniards and people in Southern Europe gesture way more frequently than people from other parts of Europe. But in multiple studies that have been done, the number of gestures that you see from an Italian person telling a story are more or less the same as what you see from a German speaker. And the difference is how big the gestures are. So
Hmm.
the German speakers are much more likely to gesture moving from the elbow. And if you move from the elbow, and I'm very sorry to you if you are on your commute and you're trying to sit there and very subtly just move your hand from the elbow, you're going to have a much smaller range of motion than if you gesture from the shoulder, which is what the Italian speakers in the data were doing more of. And so what we perceive, what is happening is that the size of the gestures are different, which we seem to perceive as more gestures in terms of frequency. So there is lots of variation across individuals, but also across cultures. But sometimes that variation isn't quite what we expected it to be.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I know there was this study about, immigrants where the first generation, um, sort of ended up not gesturing like their parents, but gesturing more like, if they were coming to the United States, they'd gesture
Mm-hmm.
more like an American, is that right?
This is a study that is so dear to my heart because this is a study from the late 30s, early 1940s, and David Efron was in New York and had access to Super 8 film technology, which was revolutionary at the time in terms of its portability and ability to be used in a variety of conditions. And part of the reason that we have only seen an explosion in the study of gesture in the last few decades is because it is deeply tied to being able to record it. Gesture
Mm,
is so
mhm.
ephemeral, and this relationship between the evolution of gesture studies and the evolution of available video technology really go hand in hand. And Efron is one of the earliest. Before him, most of the accounts of gesture that we have are very, I observe that people do this. And have you noticed that people use this kind of gesture sometimes? Whereas he recorded Italian migrants and Lithuanian Jewish migrants to New York. And he recorded, I mean, only men, but recorded men outside in social interactions with other men from the same community. And he measured the number of gestures, but also how people articulated their gestures, whether it was, from the elbows or from the shoulders. He found the Lithuanian men who were more recent migrants tended to gesture kind of straight out in front of their body in a very up and down manner, whereas the Italian men, when they were gesturing with other people from their community, tended to gesture more from the shoulder. That similar finding to what we saw
Mhm.
before, and they tend to gesture outwards from the body, left and right more. So they
Hmm.
have these different gesture profiles. And then he looked at their sons and grandsons who had become second generation migrants, grew up maybe speaking Italian or Yiddish still, but also integrated into American society, American English speakers, and they gestured much more like other American English speakers and much more like each other. And so for Efron, this was really important because he was trying to show that the way that you gesture is part of the language and the social culture that you're brought up in, and it's not something that is intrinsic to you as a person.
It's not like a biological thing.
No, it's absolutely how you're socialized, the language that you grow up in, the environment that you are raised in. And we, as a field of research, keep coming back to this early work because it was one of the first times someone said, what is actually happening moment by moment with the gestures that people use, and how can we use modern recording technology to really answer those questions?
As opposed to having to bring people into the lab and have them in an artificial environment. That's so great.
Yeah, or trying to take a whole bunch of photographs and seeing what happened.
Yeah.
So, and he also has these absolutely beautiful early 1940s black and white illustrations of what's happening from Stuyvesant Van Veen, who was a artist and graphic designer at the time, and
Oh, wow.
they're just so they're so full of personality, and I think that's also part of the real fun of that research.
Yeah. And even though it's something that we do to help us communicate with others, it was also fascinating that it's something that we do at some level somehow for ourselves because we do it when no one's watching.
Mm-hmm. So even if you are on the telephone, or even if you're recording a voicemail or you're recording a podcast episode when no one is there, there's a very good chance that you are still gesturing uh, because we are so used to it being tied up with the speech that we use that we can't help but include those gestures in our speech. Again, they do change. We're always unconsciously thinking about our audience as well. So if you're on a phone call, you may gesture less frequently and your gestures might be smaller. And then most of the research seems to show that the less your audience exists, the less you gesture. There's a pretty good correlation. So if you're on a phone call, there'll be gestures and there'll be slightly less if you're recording something for an audience who will hear it in the future. And then
Mhm.
there's this nice condition where they were told to just record something and no one will ever listen to it, but it's for their own, chance to practice. And then there were even fewer gestures. So again, we're always shifting the way we gesture.